Hi, we continue in Luke 12 today, although I've left on the left side of the screen the text where we were last time at verse 35 to highlight something we're going to look at in our passage today, starting in verse 41. Because we saw a number of verses, and you can see them on the left side of the screen now, about masters and slaves that were each really separate stories. We saw in verse 36 the question of waiting for the master to return from a wedding banquet. But then, right after the return from the wedding banquet, is the question of the thief coming in, and the owner wouldn't, if the owner had known what time the thief was coming, and then a direct address to you, the audience, or disciples in the story, for the human one coming at an unexpected hour. And as we continue today, after Peter's question that interrupts that Jesus doesn't answer, then it goes on to the question of a prudent manager, and then it drops the question of the manager and talks about the slave will be put in charge of possessions. Then it talks about the master being delayed and a slave eating and drinking, getting drunk, and the question of cutting the slave to pieces or giving them a beating. And so a whole lot of master-slave things here. And to keep us from going off the rails and reading these, as many people do naively, believing completely wrongly that these are allegorical stories about God, and that somehow God is the master who's cutting up disciples into pieces if they're not faithful, we have to read it in context to understand that that's the exact opposite of what Luke wants us to understand. So first, let's go back and see where we are in the thematic map through Luke 12. And that's the first key. And the narrative context shows continuity both within chapter 12 itself and then back to chapter 11. So I won't go over everything we've been seeing. You can look back to the previous videos to do that. But the main point is that it flows out of effective prayer. That when people are in right relationship with God and trust that God is listening and they can hear God's voice, then total commitment is required. And we saw earlier in the chapter how Jesus dealt with the fear and the anxiety that can come from having one's allegiance to the empire taken away and losing the connections that allow one to survive within that context. And Jesus ensuring that the people believe that God will take care of those needs. We also then followed how they must be awake and ready to serve. And now we get to this further passage about the threat of violence. And I want to get to the bottom line first that we see here in this little blue box that highlights the contrast, and that's the main thing. In Roman master-slave relationships, slaves do their master's will for fear of physical punishment and abuse, which Jesus gives several examples of in the story. But Jesus' lordship does not threaten or use violence to achieve service, like Roman lords. Thus, one is called to serve out of trust in the human one, rather than because of threats of violence. And that's key to really the whole, not only to this passage, but to really the whole gospel, that to be faithful to the kingdom of God is not a matter of violence and threats and exclusion, but of everybody being included socially and economically, as we've seen. So the masters in our passage here are not examples. They're not little allegorical stand-ins for Jesus, nor are they what the disciples should be, but examples of what the Roman audience knows well are the normal relationships between masters and slaves, which is brutal, oppressive, and violent. And Jesus offering a contrast there. So let's see how that plays out. We've seen how our passage here is very close to the similar passage in Matthew 24, although plainly that's in a very different context, very late in the story. But the parts we're looking at now are the parts that are bolded, and that's really what they have in common. So this story is really very similar in Matthew and Luke, so we don't need to look at differences. We've also seen slaves throughout, and not only in our passage here, but we're going to see in a moment how this connects to other slave passages we'll see later. And Luke is not soften the perspective of how Roman slaves are seen. Some people see that, interpreters see that as Luke being quote-unquote conservative, and that he's somehow justifying that. But I'd suggest it's exactly the opposite, that he's presenting in very clear terms what his audience would know well was exactly the brutality of Roman slave-master relationships, and he's offering a contrast, and that's the key here. And to read it otherwise is to miss many of the other intratextual links, and that's what we're going to look at in a minute. So for our keywords, we see in our section here plainly it's around masters and slaves repeated over and over again, but also the light blue things, the whole question of time, and we see that whole series of questions of time, and then the more down here in this little immediate section, which we'll get to. So for the intratextual links, that's what I want to highlight here. I noted last time, and we saw this, I'll go back up to it, that the issue of the wedding here was irrelevant. what's at issue here is slaves waiting for a master to return, but the fact that he was away at a wedding has nothing to do with the rest of the story. I'd like to suggest that's one example of many that's drawing our attention to intratextual links to other places in Luke's gospel where the images we're seeing here invite us to look there. So to interpret our current scene here, really today we're just starting at verse 40, but this whole section, in light of all these other passages, some of which we've looked at, but most of which we have not looked at yet. So let's just do that briefly so we can see the comparison and contrast. So we'll see another wedding, and I didn't note this in all these, but in many of these situations, it's the only place, or almost the only place, where the words in bold or the ideas in bold are listed. So when you're invited to a wedding banquet, it's a question of where you sit. So again, trying to even out the social equality there, as opposed to just sitting by the people who fit your social class. So two issues about weddings. So one could even say when the master has gone to this banquet in chapter 14 and then comes back here, but that's of course not literally what happens. Here we have when blessed are those slaves whom the master finds awake, and we saw back in the Transfiguration that although Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, they had stayed awake and they saw the glory, highlighting that point, that the awake here is both a matter of being literally awake and not asleep, but also having those apocalyptic eyes, being able to see clearly the glory and the distinction between the reign of God and the reign of the Roman Empire, or any empire. So we see here the Saturnalia-related image we saw last time, that the master will fasten the belt and have them sit down to eat and come and serve them. But we see in 17, with the same image of putting on the belt, exactly the opposite, where Jesus has the people listening, the disciples in the story, identify with the master. And would you not say to your slave, prepare supper for me and serve me while I eat and drink? Later you may eat and drink. So we get to 17, we'll have to see why these are exactly the opposite. We see in 1239 the shifting image, as I was noting, of the owner. If the owner of the house had known when the thief was coming, he wouldn't have let his house be broken into. And that echoes earlier that we saw around the Beelzebub controversy, when a strong man fully armed guards his castle, his possessions are safe. And that will relate to the issue of possessions as well that we look below, but I didn't want to make this overly complicated. So we also see here, you must be ready, for the human was coming at an unexpected hour. And way later, Peter will say to Jesus, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and death. And in the next verse, Jesus will say, no, actually, you'll deny me 3 times. So as Jesus shifts gears in 1242, and I broke this into 2 pieces, who then is the faithful and prudent manager? But for faithful, we hear these anticipated echoes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. Whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest in much. And this was not praising faithfulness there. Note that the word for faithful here, pistos, doesn't have to mean faithfulness to God. It can be faithful to anybody. It can mean also trustworthy or loyal as well. So a faithful manager is not someone who's faithful to God. It's a manager who's loyal to the owner, to the boss, to the master. And that's what's at issue here, is who are you faithful to? This is especially true in chapter 19, where reading this one as an allegory is really horrific. It makes it sound like God will destroy people who are not making money for God. But plainly, as many scholars have noted, it's a thinly veiled allegory about how Herod got power. And so the voice here is like a voice of Herod saying, good slave, you've been faithful in a small thing, take charge of 10 cities. Notice the small thing and the great thing echo into different aspects of the story here. This is in chapter 16 and this is in chapter 19, with the small thing and the large thing compared. And with the prudent manager, using the word phronenos, sometimes it's translated wise, but Sophia is the word for wise. The word for prudent here, phronenos, as we'll see, but I'll bring it up now too, is more like translated shrewdly here, or like practical wisdom, knowing how to get things done and knowing what works for you and for the system you're a part of. So the prudent manager here, and again, the manager is otherwise irrelevant to the story, is anticipating the manager here in this parable in chapter 16. As we continue down to the other part of 1242, it's not a direct verbal connection, but it's a thematic connection. So Jesus asked the rhetorical question here, whom his master will put in charge of his slaves to give them their allowance of food at the proper time, and that anticipates the need in Acts, where the Hellenists complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. So they appoint 7 men of good standing, full of spirit and wisdom, to appoint to that task. So that's not about slaves, of course, and that's part of the difference. We hear here that the master will put that one in charge of all his possessions. And then we hear in Acts, there are no private possessions. It's the exact opposite. And we could have connected this one to chapter 19 too, the getting the cities, as we just saw back up here. But plainly, putting someone in charge of possessions is not representing what Jesus wants. He wants people to share the possessions so no one has private ownership of anything and everything is held in common. We see also in this little, is it a parable? At least this little soliloquy, the slave says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, that prefaces his doing bad things, which is to eat and drink and get drunk. And here, the rich farmer that we saw in the parable earlier in the chapter, also thinking to myself, what should I do? And he doesn't realize that his life is demanded that very night. Notice that both of those are about not recognizing what the time is. And then finally, the master of that slave will come at a day he does not expect, an hour he doesn't know, cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful, connecting with 1927, where the enemies who didn't want him to be king over them, that's the enemies of Herod, bring them here and slaughter them in my presence. And similarly, around the issue of put him with the unfaithful, Jesus said back in chapter 9, you faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? So the question of the faithful being with Jesus or not in both those places. So we can't obviously read all of those stories here, but the point I'm making, I hope that Luke is making, is that to understand any one of these scenes, we really need to hear the whole story. So all of what we're doing is a little bit tentative along the way until we complete it. But I wanted to highlight for our passage today, starting with Peter's question, that we're not going to read this as an allegory, that Jesus is assuming that you should be like the master or the manager here. So with all that in mind, let's look at our passage. So Peter, who we last heard of the Transfiguration, which echoes into our passage here as well, right here, staying awake. I don't necessarily think that that's specifically why we're hearing Peter, is to remind us of the staying awake, but it might be because anybody could have asked, and there's nothing special about Peter asking here. So Lord, are you telling this parable, which we hadn't heard it was a parable, but he brings that up. Do we trust that Peter's calling it a parable makes it a parable? What makes something a parable? Well, I won't get into all that now, but it seems to simply be a story about how things work in the Roman Empire. We noted earlier that Jesus had said to be like. We can go back up to that where he had said he'd be like those who are waiting for their master to return. So he didn't say be those, but there he made the specific comparison addressed to them. Have your lamps lit and be like those. But now we're not hearing be like. So we can't assume that unless it says that, and that's important. So for us or for everyone, and as my note below suggests, it underscores the ambiguous relationship between the crowd and the disciples, although at 22 Jesus explicitly said to address the disciples and turns to the crowd explicitly only in 12:54. So maybe Peter wasn't sure either. Remember, there's a crowd that was described as thousands and thousands trampling on each other at the beginning of the chapter. And so he continues here, and this is the second time in the chapter that Jesus is referred to as Lord. So the Lord said, who then is the faithful and prudent manager? And we've looked at that here, the pistos, and those are the exact examples, noting those are the only times that word is used. And prudent here, phronimos, as I noted, and here only in this other place. Again, the point I'd made. Manager, oikonomos here, and only in Luke 16:1, making that connection as well. So three words there, pointing us either to chapter 16 or to something else here. As my note below adds, the audience's experience with managers is called upon. Also, the effect of divided inheritances. Back, the first person who interrupted Jesus, telling him to tell his brother to divide the inheritance, and about absentee landowners, and we'll see more about that. So the Lord said, whom his Lord, highlighting Kyrios in both places here, will put in charge. And there's an interesting parallel here. I can scroll down so we can see this a little bit. I almost did this schematically, but you can see it just as well here. Notice the manager whom his master will put in charge of the slaves to give him the food, but here the slave whom the master will put in charge of all his possessions. So there's a little hierarchical parallel there, that the master puts the manager in charge of giving the food to the fellow slaves. The manager is still a slave, and then the slave who's at work, who the master puts in charge of the possessions. Notice it implies that only one slave is at work, because plainly only one can be in charge, so it's suggesting there's some unknown number of slaves and only one is at work here, or literally doing anything. And blessed here makes it more quote-unquote religious sounding than it might seem. As many scholars have noted, the word makarios can also simply mean fortunate, and that's perhaps more important here. Fortunate in the sense that you'll avoid the beating by the master. It's not necessarily blessed in the sense that God has a role in it, and note that God is not mentioned here. So fortunate is the slave because they not only will be put in charge of more, but they won't get beaten. But as a couple of scholars have noted here, there's some issues around possessions. We've seen it several times in here. The sequence begun in 12:15. Because disciples, instead of seeking possessions, are told to sell them and receive as gift responsibility for the master's possessions. But there's nothing about selling here, so we're not that's not completely clear. So now we hear, as Vincent notes below, slaves who forget their station in life and act like fools are standard fare in ancient fiction, comedic drama, and satirical poetry, and the audience knows what to expect. As Beavis notes in an article about Roman slavery and the passage in chapter 16, not our immediate passage, but this is still relevant, she says, for ancient slaves, freedom was the coveted recompense for good service, whereas in the parables, wise and faithful slaves are rewarded with more responsibility. And that will really be the theme here, the more that we see here, more required down there. So more responsibility rather than freedom. One would think the servant would say, "Yay, I'm set free." Although being given more responsibility would probably mean being put in a more elite position. In the Roman world, as in American chattel slavery with black Africans, there was quite a difference between the house slaves and the field slaves in terms of responsibility and how they were treated. So that could certainly be a promotion, so to speak, here, but what they'd really want is release. And notice how it shifts here. So it was the question that Jesus asked was about the manager. He doesn't answer that question at all. He says, "Blessed is the slave whom his master finds at work," but doesn't address the question of a faithful and prudent manager. But then if that slave, presumably the one who is at work, says to himself, echoing literally in his heart, but echoing the self-talk of the farmer, "My master is delayed in coming." Chronozai here, a term also from 121, but only there. Marshall notes it's often associated with the parousia, and that's what leads many interpreters to read this as if it's an allegory of Jesus' delay. That Jesus is the master and that the disciples are sitting around beating people and eating and drinking, getting drunk and forgetting what's going on, and when he comes, boy, is he going to give it to them. And yet there's been nothing in here about that. There's been nothing that brings up the issue of Jesus' delay. Matthew has that issue a couple times about hearts growing cool, that the initial fervor for discipleship would lose its heat over time and it would need to be revved up again. But that's certainly not the theme in our passage here, and Luke has said nothing about that, and this is really not about Jesus or his delay of any kind. So it may fit with that, but we have be careful to not impose that on here, because that's simply not what it's talking about. And the master is delayed, and what he would do when he's delayed, surprisingly, is beat the other slaves. And notice that in these verses, there's 3 different words, all translated beat, really coming around it from different angles, although there's not a basic meaning difference that would suggest that it's worth paying attention to. They all involve what it sounds like is applying violent force to somebody. Notice it includes men and women here, which is really unusual. And it's not using doulos, the word for slaves here, or the normal words for men and women. It's using the word for like children, pious and paidiske, slave boy or slave girl, or just young boy or young girl. So that's an interesting thing that was otherwise not part of the scenario. And it describes to eat and drink and get drunk. And we've seen that earlier, exactly what Jesus was talking about is don't be worried, don't be anxious about what you're to eat and drink. The slaves aren't worried about it or anxious about it because the master has plenty, but they're not supposed to be getting drunk while the master's delayed. This is like kids whose parents aren't home and they think, hey, let's raid the wine cabinet or the cookie jar or whatever it is. Drunk only here in the Synoptics. It's only in John 2:10 around the wedding at Cana story. So it's another unusual word, many unusual words here. So if that's what happens and the slave goes crazy, the master of that house will come in a day when he does not expect it. Here, prosdoka here, and used a couple times earlier for expectations, at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces, literally dichotomize him, dichotomese, linking with Satan in the divided house, although that's not specifically an intratextual reference, because this isn't about cutting houses. But plainly, can we imagine that Jesus is suggesting this is what God would do? That if you happen to act out one day, that God would cut you in pieces? Certainly not. There's been nothing about the God of Jesus here that's suggesting that kind of violence. And exclude him and put him with the unfaithful. Although the word for meros here means part, it could also mean inheritance. It's also a word for inheritance, the part you inherit. So Dowling suggests he will put his part with the unfaithful outside the group. Matthew has a standard Matthew phrase there where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we're almost done here. So the slave who knew what his master wanted but did not prepare or do what he wanted will receive a severe beating. And again, we cannot imagine God giving somebody a beating for not being prepared. The preparation is what we saw earlier, and certainly Jesus explicitly wants his disciples to be prepared, but he's not threatening with a beating. Notice the contrast. The one who did not know, how can we imagine a situation where one does not know that the master didn't want them to be drunk when he got home? So that's hard to imagine who would fall into the category of didn't know. Maybe it's implying disciples who don't know, but again, this is contained within the story here. I'm hesitant to take it outside the story and make it an allegory. So the one that did not know what merited a pounding, basically, will receive a lighter beating. And the word for beating is really not beating, it's a lashing with lashes here. So this is a question of many lashes or fewer lashes, which matches the many issue here and the more issue here. So what you want is not more lashes. What you want is more responsibility to carry out the gospel. And that's where it ends. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be sought. And not required. It's not as strong as either required or entrusted. Much will be sought, and from the one to whom much has been entrusted here, parathento, which is otherwise used for setting food before another. So we could hear that as much has been required, and from the one to whom much has been set before, even more will be asked. Not as strong as demanded. So required and demanded make this seem like it's absolute, whereas what they really are is sought and asked. And so, again, the more gentle tone of Jesus asking people who are in prayer, who have the apocalyptic eyes, who let go of their fear, they've let go of their anxiety, they're prepared, and they're ready to do the Master's will. And why would they not want to do as much as they possibly can out of the joy and gratitude for what they've received, rather than out of the threat of punishment and destruction? So it shifts gears radically in verse 49, as you can see, and we'll come to hear what the fire is that Jesus is eager to have set on the earth. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.